Thanks to our generous donors from last year, we are very excited to be hosting this event tonight. And I have the honor and privilege to introduce our guest to you. Psychologist by training, she most enjoys researching how bilingualism changes the way children develop and adults learn. She works with school districts and also does lab research in pursuit of greater knowledge and innovative methods. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Gigi Luke.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here after a long day of work. I know how it is. And so the first promise I'm going to make tonight is that I'm not going to lecture you. Instead, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story how I become interested in bilingualism and what I have learned in my journey that bilingualism is a beneficial experience for all. I'm an associate professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. That's a mouthful of education here. And so I will tell you a little bit about how I become interested in this problem. When I was in an undergraduate education, I was very interested in how people coming from different parts of the world have similar ideas, similar moral values, and how do they communicate with each other. So that's a kind of problem that prompts me to start looking at how language become a vehicle for thought. So how language is a tool to develop deeper thinking. And as I investigate this problem a little bit further, I become extremely interested in how children learn, especially those children who acquire 2 languages or more. And in this journey, what I realized is that from the experience of learning multiple languages, you're also gaining insight into how languages work. And this insight is generalized to learning other things. And using this type of thinking, I developed myself as a psychologist, and then I become interested in the human brain. I have very broad interest in my very limited medium amount of life. And so I become interested in neuroscience in the control center of our human body. So we have to pick an organ to study to control human behavior. The brain would be the one that you go. So I also did some training at a geriatric hospital to learn methods to understand how the brain works in networks, like in a concert, not in an isolated way. And finally, a couple of years later, I realized that what we learn in understanding bilingualism can have broad implications for education. So I become a faculty member in a school of education, hoping to bring some of the scientific knowledge of bilingualism into how practice works. And so that defines my career in the last few years. So in tonight's talk, I'm going to share with you what we have learned so far about the bilingual mind and brain. And then we're going to think a little bit deeper as adults of a globalized society who are bilingual. How do we define bilingual? And what do we want our children to become? And finally, I will tell you a little bit about how I see the work that we do in understanding the science of bilingualism that can be extended to education. So let's just start with the bilingual mind and brain. So the bilingual mind is an intricate experience to begin with. You always started with some form of language knowledge, and then slowly or simultaneously you add another language to your mind. And throughout this process, some of you may realize that, oh, it's kind of effortful to keep the 2 languages apart. Other times you may feel like it takes a lot of effort to really acquire another language, especially at my age. So you experience sometimes language interference, because when the 2 languages are similar to each other, you may experience interference from the other language. But thankfully, we have our human brain who is very plastic to adapt to this environment. So we have cognitive control to help us sort through this information and also bring in relative resources when we need it to learn in 2 languages. So let's all this start from infancy. One question psychologists have been very interested in, do babies have a preference for a language that they're exposed to the most? Okay? Now babies who are a couple days old have already been hearing what's in the environment for a couple of months. Surprisingly, our auditory systems start working in utero a couple of months before they arrive to the Earth. To the Earth, they've always been on Earth. To the atmosphere. So there's a group of researchers in Canada. They started to look into this problem by looking at whether a couple days old, 5 days old infants have a preference to the language that they're exposed to the most. So they recruited 3 groups of infants. The first group of infants are Tagalog English bilinguals. So these are parents who speak Tagalog and English on a daily basis. And then they recruit a group of Chinese English bilinguals. So these are parents who speak English and Chinese language simultaneously every day. And then they have a group of English monolingual babies. Now these babies are by no means lingual or verbal at all, but they're exposed to the different languages in the environment. So they use a technique called high amplitude sucking, which measures the rate of how babies suck when they hear different auditory stimuli. When you're at a hospital giving birth, your child may be exposed to some of these tests. So they will play some sounds in the baby's ears and see if the baby actually responds to those sounds. So here, the researchers are just playing different languages sequentially to observe the differences. So what they have observed is, for the Tagalog bilingual babies, they have a preference for either language. Some babies prefer Tagalog, some babies prefer English. Now, if you play the Tagalog English sentences to the Chinese English bilingual babies, what do you think? They've never been exposed to Tagalog, so they may have a more overwhelming bias to prefer English, which is another language that they have been exposed to. But at the same time, because they're more plastic in receiving sounds in the environment, because they've already been exposed to multiple languages, they may be in the middle, and that's exactly what the researchers found. Finally, for the English monolingual babies, what do you expect? English. So they're overwhelmingly choosing the language that they're most exposed to. So this type of research has shown us that babies or very young children has the capacity to gather information, gathering signal in the environment. And the signal that they extract are the signal that is most present in the environment. So they're adapting to their auditory system to what they hear in their surroundings. Now, moving forward a couple years into preschoolers, one question we have is, what about children who grow up speaking 2 languages? At that point, would they be more sensitive to sounds? So knowing what happens in babies, knowing that these babies are responding to the complexity in the environment, it may make sense to expect that it takes them longer, so they must be less sensitive to the language that they're exposed to. So here is a study that we did in Massachusetts in a Head Start schools. And we looked at the children's language dominance by gathering the teacher's report, the parents' report, and the researchers set up meetings with each child to set up a rapport, understand which language is their dominant language, and then we give them a Simon Says task, which is to ask them to do some silly things in English and Spanish, and see how many they can do. So I have an example here, touch your head, or hold your nose and jump up and down. So we ask them to do some form of these things and see how many of the instruction that they understand in each language. And the children we included are children who speak English and Spanish. And so ultimately we have about half of our sample being tested in English, which is their dominant language, and half of the sample we tested in Spanish. And if you look at the demographics, they are very comparable in age. They're also comparable in the percentage of females in each group. And the screening task in English, we have 6 items, and all the children can follow the instruction in English because they're all educated in English. And for the children who we tested in Spanish, they're also doing very well in Spanish. So they understand both type of instructions. And so we give them a task that measures metalinguistic awareness. So what is a metalinguistic awareness? It's just a fancy word to tell you how sensitive they are to understand how language works. So we use a standardized test called the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals Preschool 2, or for short, SELF-P2, that is available in both English and Spanish, but I'm going to show you only English results. This test, like an IQ test, has a population mean. So the mean here is 10, and the standard deviation is 3, meaning that there's some variation across the board. So we give them a few items. The first condition that we give them is called sentence structure. So what we do here is you see the 4 pictures on the side, and I say, which one smells good? Okay, so if you understand what smells is, and if you understand what each picture is, you would pick the rose. We do have children pick books. I don't blame them. And so with the 2 groups of children tested in different languages, we found that they're very comparable performing this task in sentence structure. So understanding the meaning of a word and understanding the meaning in each picture. But they were all below 10, meaning that they're quite far away from the norm. Okay? And then the second condition is called concepts and following directions. So in this picture here, I would like you to point to the monkey and then point to the turtle. So it's a series of instructions that you have to keep in mind. You have to understand the instruction, keep that in mind, and execute it. So for this type of test, we see that the children who are being tested in Spanish are doing slightly better than the children who we tested in English. And finally, we have a task called word classes. So here I show you 3 pictures, and I ask the child, which 2 goes together? So you're looking for semantic affiliation here. So the picture of a dog and a picture of a cat would go with each other. And with this, surprisingly, we have the children who are in the most bilingual environment, who speak mostly Spanish at home, but being educated in English are doing better, and they're not significantly different from the performance. Now keep in mind that these children we tested are from very low income background, and we particularly choose the most challenging neighborhoods to do our experiments in, because we want to see whether bilingualism interacts with the environment that these children are in. Next, we give them something a little bit more experimental. We go back to our question to look at how sensitive they are to sounds in their environment. So if they're exposed to more sounds in the environment, meaning that the statistical complexity of sounds in the environment are much higher, they may be less sensitive to sounds in each language, because it takes them a little bit longer to figure out what these sounds are affiliated with. So we made up a test, we worked with some linguists, and we found out that there are sounds that are pretty general across all languages, such as ba, ga, ta. So these are syllables that are general across all languages. And for the 2 groups of children, they perform very similarly and at a high level. And there are sounds that are specific to English, such as v, the V sound, or th, the TH sound. So if you have children in your family, you realize that sometimes they may say Thursday as Thursday. And very often you have to explicitly to tell them to say Thursday, to make sure that they understand that specific sound that may not be as present in other languages. And for this kind of sound, we found that children being tested in English are doing slightly better, but they're not very different. And finally, we have some sounds in Russian. And honestly, as an experimenter, I have to say I cannot distinguish those sounds, so I'm not going to reproduce it here for you, because you will never hear the difference anyway. So there are a Z sound that sounds different in Russia, but I can't produce that. So when we give this sound that these children have never been exposed to, and we found that the children who are more bilingual, the Spanish-English bilingual children are performing at chance. So they're just taking a guess. So what this line of research tells us is the environment, the complexity in the environment is shaping how children learn. And for some children, it may take them longer to consolidate the information in the environment. So we shouldn't expect a monotonic or a unidirectional development for these children who are growing up in a more complex linguistic environment. So now we have seen some evidence to demonstrate that first, all children can learn different languages, and second, Some children takes a little bit longer because the linguistic environment in their surroundings are a little bit more complex. And third, we know that from birth, they do pay attention to the environment. So using some of these knowledge, psychologists have put together different models, and we know that in a bilingual child's world, there are two forces at play. First, we have the exogenous bottom-up process. So these are processed in the environment that we know shape how we make decisions. But that's not the only source. We also have an endogenous top-down process in which we have to decide which language to pay attention to, which language to suppress. So it's two sides of the same coin that we're trying to play, being very flexible here and pay attention to the language that is going to help us to make a decision right now and here. And another line of psycholinguistic research has also put together a model that simulates how a bilingual works when we have to build knowledge. So for a concept, for any knowledge, it should be language free. So for knowledge, it's an entity that we developed as a concept, and it should be accessible by either language in a bilingual's mind. But there is a dominance in language. So even though there's an ideal world that you are fluent bilingual, you still have a language that is more dominant, more fluent, stronger than the other language. So the access of concepts through this first language is more readily available and is much more direct. At the same time, the access through the concept through a developing second language, it's a little bit indirect. So very often, you see a different relationship or response time in translating between the knowledge between the two languages. And very often, we also found that even if you're being tested in the first language, that is your stronger language, more dominant language, it takes you a little bit while because you have to keep suppressing the other language that is not at play. So you're still exercising your cognitive control to fight off the linguistic interference. So essentially, what you have to remember is the bilingual mind is like this model here. It's very zen, but at the same time, there's a constant imbalance. You are flipping your attention to one of the two languages. Sometimes it is easier because it's in a domain that you're educated in. Sometimes it's a little bit harder because you're still developing vocabulary or linguistic repertoires to think fluently in that language. So in a nutshell, what we understand as a bilingual mind is that there's a constant struggle between the two languages. They're always in competition. And surprisingly, as fluent as we are, we try to shut down the other language, but we can't. It's constantly active. And the joint attention of the two languages will lead to your need to ignore the language that is not in use and focus on the target language. And that gives rise to cognitive flexibility. And we also have a line of research demonstrating to us that children who speak multiple languages are doing better in some cognitive tasks. So they're more flexible, they're more fluid, and they're more willing to change the route to get to a goal. Now that's how the bilingual mind works. But what about the brain? How does the brain fit into this picture here? So before we go into the results of the brain, let's see what's in our brain. Okay, we primarily have three things in our brain. That's a real brain. I don't think that's my brain, but that's a real brain. We have gray matter, and we have white matter, and we have cerebrospinal fluid. And the way that I do my work to study the brain is we put people in the MR machine. Okay? So when you're doing an MR machine, you realize that when you take high-resolution picture, movement is a big problem. And there's why so few studies have been done on younger children. Because if you ask them to stay still for 45 minutes, you cannot move your head for more than 3 millimeters, it's not going to happen. Everybody knows that in the audience. So as ambitious as may sound, we're now trying to collect data in middle school children. Okay, it's still quite challenging, I can tell you, even at middle school age. We'll get there. So here with the 3 types of matter in our brain, the typical brain picture that you see, like a picture that I show here, is generated from high-resolution picture that shows us the structure of the brain. So I don't know if you see the bright white circumference of this picture is the skull, and then if you strip it away, then you have the membrane, and the black area is cerebrospinal fluid. There's fluid in our brain that act as a shock absorption, just in case our brain is getting too compact. And then if you look a little bit closer, the walnut shape is the outer area that is denoted as the gray matter. So that's a gray matter where we have neurons, and these are the neurons that have functions. So we can observe functional activities in a statistical way in these matter. But the large chunk of our brain actually has white matter. So those are the information highway in our brain that connects far away brain area. So in our brain here, which is very interesting that our eyes are here, but our occipital cortex, so the part of the brain that processes visual information, is actually at the back of our brain. So all this information that we gather in our eyes gets sent all the way to the back of the brain, and surprisingly, gets sent forward for processing. So different parts of the brain are responsible for different information processing. And when we look at the MRI images, because we're interested in brain activity, what we have to do is to sacrifice something, because collecting these high-resolution pictures and then processing them, it's very, very intensive. So we have to give up some of the resolution to collect information across time, so we can know how brain activity fluctuates across time. So that's how we observe brain activity, like this image here. This is an image of a group of individuals doing nothing in the scanner. So we're recently developing a new technique called the resting state. Very often when you do functional MRI, you are asked to do something in the scanner. And usually these tasks are pretty artificial. So you may be asked to look at some words and make some decisions, look at some pictures, make some decisions. And so we always feel that if we always give people something to do, they bring in different biases. So if you're a video game player, so we know that you'll be doing pretty well in these tasks because these are very easy tasks compared to video games. And if you are bilingual, we also know that if we give you a word task, we know that it's going to be very taxing because you're now playing with the 2 languages in your mind. And so researchers in the field developed this resting state technique. Essentially, you're lying in a scanner not doing anything. We told you to not think of anything in particular, but open your eyes because we do not want to image a sleeping brain. And then you just lie there for 5-6 minutes. And what we observe and we would extract is the spontaneous brain activity. And surprisingly, even at rest, our brain works coherently in the network that we see in younger children, in older adults, and of course in younger adults. And that's the technique that we use. Finally, with the white matter, we are tracking water molecules diffusion in these information highways. We don't know where they're going. We would love to know, but we don't have the capacity yet. But we know the directions in the 3-dimensional space. We know that through the water diffusion, we know that whether the tracks are going left and right, front and back, and bottom and up in the brain. So that's the kind of information that we collect. So using these type of techniques, what I'm most interested in is for people who have the longest experience of exercising both languages, would we see a difference in the brain structure, particularly in the information highway in the white matter? And so I started doing this project at a geriatric hospital looking at older people at 70 years of age. Now, why pick 70? Why not 50, 60? Surprisingly, we get old every day. Bilingualism is not the fountain of youth. Bilinguals also get old every day. But if I believe that bilingualism is an experience that would change our brain structure and defray some of these neurodegenerative symptoms that is naturally occurring, I should see it in the older people. It's just a safety bet for doing research. Make sure I have results that I can report. So here you have a picture of a brain that is like you're looking at me face to face. But remember, we're not interested in the neurons or the gray matter in the brain. So you take it away, and now you come with a skeleton. Because my brain is different from your brain, so what I have to do is to put together the entire sample and identify the space that is considered as white matter across the entire sample. So this white matter structure looks slightly different than what I showed you before, because these are the common white matter space. And after mathematically we do that, we didn't really look into the brain, so it's mathematical. After we do that mathematically, we do statistical tests to see whether the older people with bilingual experience have more water diffusion in the white matter tracts, signifying that the waters are more directionally flowing in the brain. We also do another test to see if the people who have lifelong monolingual experience have the same results. And surprisingly, we don't see anything in the monolingual older adults having more water diffusions in their brain. But we see in the orange pixels here that the bilingual older adults are having more directional water diffusion in the white matter tracts. So I'm going to rotate this picture and you can tell me what you see in this picture. So where are the orange pixels? Are they in the front of the brain or are they in the back of the brain? They're more in the front. And they're more in the brain structure that connects the two hemispheres. So we observe a lot of our results in the corpus callosum. And that's the brain structure that connects the two hemispheres. And all the results are mostly in the front part of the brain, not in the back part of the brain. So it doesn't change the way we process sound information or the way we see things perceptually, but it changes how the brain area that is responsible for cognitive control, the structure that corresponds to helping us to sort out information in an orderly fashion in the environment. And following the white matter analysis, I also looked at these older people's brain to see if we can see a more coherent, functional brain network. The reason being that if you are bilingual, and remember you have to constantly make decisions about the outside environment and the inside environment, so what I should see is a more coherent brain network because they have been working together more often. And that's also what we see in this other picture, that you have the blue area. It's a network, what we call default network. So that's a network that we always see in people when they're doing nothing in the scanner. So when you have people telling you that we only use 10% of our brain, show them this picture. We definitely use more than 10% even when we're at rest. So now we understand bilingualism, lifelong experiences, changes our brain functions and structure in the old age. But what about development? What about bilingualism and learning? So to get into the crux of this issue, we have to think a lot more about the problem in education that we want to bring into the scientific brain of research and how neuroscience can help us answer that question. This is very new work that we've just started to do last year. And so we developed this task in a scanner where we asked individuals coming into our laboratory, young adults, college students, do they know anything about how the earth works? So we excluded people from the earth science program because we're about to make them learn about earth sciences. So if they're in an earth science program, they can't participate in the study. So we asked them how seismic wave works and do you know how to detect earthquakes? Most of the responses that we got was, I remember learning in high school, that's about it. And so those are the kind of people that we include in a study. And this is my low-cost graphical demonstration of how the study works. We put the people in a scanner and we show them a video that we developed in-house. So we developed this video based on the Massachusetts curriculum of science frameworks in earth science. And we turned the language from the adult level to a 9th grade level. So we based the materials and then we turned the language into a 9th grade level, and we have help from in-service and previous teachers to do this. And then we recorded a video look like this. We have a narrator on one side, and then we have some two-dimensional pictures on the other side. There's no animation, no fancy animation. We want to make sure that the information that we want our participants to learn are coming from the spoken language. Okay? Put in their earplugs, and then we put them in the scanner and watch this video for 7 minutes. And then when they come out, what we do is we ask them questions, very much like what a classroom teacher would do. So we ask them, tell us what you have learned. Okay, so they free recall the information that they have learned, and we qualitatively code all these information and derive a metric of linguistic complexity. So we looked at how many big words do they use? Are their sentence structures complex? So we looked at semantics and morphosyntactic features of their production. And we also give them probing question, very much like what the teachers do, except it's in an oral language form. And we ask them 12 questions, and we grade their responses like a teacher would grade an exam on a short answer using a rubric, and then everybody get an accuracy point. So what we try to do is to connect antecedents of experiences with the brain functions happening during learning and their learning outcome in spoken language. So I'll tell you why I didn't want to give them a written test or a multiple choice exam. The reason why is we developed this design hoping to study children who are bilingual, who may be learning in their second language, and also children who have reading difficulty. So if we give them a reading test, we will defeat the entire purpose. We want to make sure that our experimental paradigm is fair to everybody. So that's why we decided to go with the oral language, even though it's much more labor-intensive to do. So what we observed here is I have a lot of young adults in this study, and we only included those who speak English as their first language, but they learn a second language at different points in their time. Now, if you imagine if you only speak English, and then we give you an English task, your performance shouldn't be influenced by the language proficiency that you speak, because that's your only dominant language. But now we're looking at these adults who also have second language learning experience, because if you give this task to a person who speaks English as a first language and people who speak English as a second language, of course you're going to see differences. And that's not interesting. What will be really interesting is to see people who speak a first language that is in the task, but also have a second language experience, but show differences along the way. So we gave the first language experience, English speakers this task, and we look at it at a different age. And what we observed is that there are different networks at play here. So of course there's a network that looking at things at the back of the brain. There's an attention network. And very interestingly, the network that is coupling the attention with the visual processing area of the brain is correlated with the age at which these people started learning a second language. So if you look at this line graph here, the later you learn a second language, the more you recruit this brain area when you are learning in your first language. So it gets to what we understand as the language interference. So no matter what language you speak and you add another one in, you are changing the system by creating interference. But at the same time, you're also exercising your brain to pay attention to the signal in this system and sort it out. So in a way, you're making your brain go to the gym every day by speaking two languages. So many of you may wonder, okay, so now if I have a child who's growing up bilingually, am I making the right decision? I myself as a parent wonder about that too. But then I remember some older literature in brain plasticity actually speaks to that. So we have, as adults, we have this expectation that development is linear and is unidirectional. But I think all of you as parents in the audience can attest to the fact that you have some observations that sometimes development is regressive. Maybe multiple occasions. And if that's the case, we shouldn't expect development to be a linear relationship with age. And we know that there are differences, individual differences that speaks to the variation of first language development, let alone second language. Think about a bilingual child's environment. Now that in the environment, the languages that they can ignore as noise is not noise anymore. They become signal. So now they have to be more attentive to the languages happening in their area. And so we shouldn't even expect to see a unidirectional relationship. What we should expect is something like this. Because they may start it out a little bit slower, because it takes time to sort out the information in the environment, and it's a daunting task. But at a certain point, you will work over that bottleneck and get to the point that you become fluent in using both languages, and it's become less effortful for you. So that's the kind of analogy that I say as a researcher. So you may ask, where are the evidence? So let's take a look at the concept of bilingualism here. Now, bear with me. I always ask this question when I go to give a talk everywhere I go, and I always have really interesting observations, and coupled with census data in different countries, it's actually quite accurate. So let's say you're a random sample here, and I ask you this question. Are you a bilingual? And you have three choices. You can say yes, you can say no, you can say I don't know. Okay, so who would say yes? Okay, that's already a bias sample here in the United States, I have to say. Who say no? Okay, who say I don't know? Okay, so can I pick some of these I don't know people, or is it not a good place to do? Can you tell me why you say you don't know? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think I speak English really well, but I think I don't consider myself bilingual. I still have an accent, and I consider bilingual people can speak two languages or more in the proper way.
Very good. So that's one reason when I go to Asia to give talks and I speak in English. And I have all these students sitting in front of me, and they all seem to understand what I say, but when I ask this question, nobody tell me that they're bilingual. And then I start to wonder, do they understand what I'm saying? And then we get to the bar, and I ask them, like, why didn't you guys say you're bilingual? I'm just intrigued by this response. And they always looked at me and said, well, I only understand what you're saying because I've learned this knowledge in this language, and I only use this knowledge, or my English has accent. So I don't consider myself bilingual. But when I go to Europe, when I ask these questions, these Europeans look at me like, everyone here is bilingual. Like, what are you talking about? And so you have these different ideas about how to quantify and qualify your life experiences to be a bilingual or not. And surprisingly, there's various positions in the research community, but together we know that there are a couple of factors in adults. We know that how early you start learning a language kind of helps you to determine whether you're bilingual or not. Of course, the earlier the better. We know that how well you speak another language with or without accent, or how well you speak this language in a specific domain qualify you as bilingual or not. We also know how often you use both languages. So I often call some of these participants in my studies weekend bilinguals. They're weekend bilinguals because they only talk to their grandparents in their heritage language on the weekend. Kind of like weekend drivers. And so can they be bilingual? So yeah, in a broad way, they are bilingual. They have the knowledge of the language, and they just don't use it in a certain context. And they use it less frequently, so they're less bilingual. For the children in this school, I would say that there are fluent bilinguals. They're being educated in a language that they're not getting at home, or they may be getting at home. But these kind of academic language training, making them ready to become a fluent bilingual. So, knowing researchers, we like black and white because we're boring. But we also like labels. And surprisingly, when you look into the research, you see different buckets of labels. So for people who are interested in the history of becoming bilinguals, you may see some of these terms in the popular media or in research papers. For people who are interested in functional usage, you see this group of labels. For people who are interested in proficiency, how well you speak the language, they use different labels. And for people who are interested in how people get there in the learning process, they use different labels. And believe me, these are all labels extracted from the literature. So you have all these different labels, and one of the disconnections between research and practice is that I can't make a teacher understand the clear differences between these labels, because what they're dealing with is the intersection of these 4 quadrants every day. And these 4 quadrants, as I intentionally put them in a very messy way, means that they're not mutually exclusive and they're all correlated. And so with all these complexity, how do we bridge research from what we understand as bilingualism as being a beneficial life experience to practice? We have to think a little bit deeper. So now I'm going to turn my head as a scientist to become an educator. And here, I'm going to break away from this black and white model of looking at monolingual versus bilingual. The reality is that monolingualism and bilingualism are too extreme that is theoretical. Most people are actually in this gray area. And I have to pardon my very poor graphic skills. Actually, what I really wanted to show is here not a unidimensional scale, but a multidimensional space. Because you can also look at different things and qualify whether you're bilingual or not. But most of the time, people are in this gray scale somewhere. And understanding the research, we have to keep in mind that this black and white model doesn't work, and we have to follow a gray model. But of course, the research economy prohibits us to do that because it's very expensive to look at gradients rather than looking at groups. And so when you consume research, what you will see here is there might be research comparing these 2 groups in study 1 here that I call them monolingual bilingual. There might be research studies that look at these different groups. They're further away. So you can't really use the argument of whether they're same, different, or they're better or worse. You have to think of them as a continuum. And I haven't even talked about the international context of how bilingualism is perceived internationally. And so, how do we bridge this gap in research into what we care the most about our children of tomorrow, which is why is bilingualism research relevant to education? Where do we even start? Now let's go back to the science a little bit here. Language and cognition are the 2 developmental aspects that interact during the school age. So if you look at this figure here, the horizontal axis, you have birth, month, and years. So the blue line indicates how plastic, how readily available we are to learn language. And there's a peak. So the peak is around 1-2 years old during the toddlerhood, when we're most receptive to the sounds in the environment and also most exploratory in producing the sounds that simulate the adult language. So you have a lot of babbling going on, playing around languages. Higher cognitive functions such as executive functions, cognitive control, started a little bit later on, but the most plastic period is actually around the school age. So if a child has different language experiences, and this language experience requires them to exercise cognitive control, what we observe is there's a large overlapping area in the developmental curve of plasticity under these 2 areas. So in a way, theoretically, research in bilingualism is essential to education, because a lot of this overlapping time happens during school age. But bilingualism in education hasn't been in a marriage for the past couple of years. Unlike researchers who study bilingualism in education, we have a different category. People focus a lot more on fluency in a language. So if you're familiar with the American education system, we have a category of students we call English learners. So we have students who are English learners and those who are not, right? And the English learners are bilingual, but they're only one subgroup of bilinguals. We also have students who are fluent in English and another language, but they're all looped into this non-English learners group. So to tackle this problem, I started to look into state-level data. I just love data, as you can tell here. I do secondary data analysis on 2013 third grade Massachusetts standardized exam called MCAS, or Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System. And I looked at 58,000 students in general education, so they're not in special education. large sample size, and I have no control over these data because I didn't collect all these data. There's no way I can in my lifespan. And instead of looking at whether they're English learners or not, in the state level data, I can actually look at whether they are, they reported English as their first language. I can identify those whose parents reported that English is not their first language, but they have never needed the English service. So these are pretty bilingual students. And then we have students whose first language is not English, but they were English learners, but now they're reclassified. So we call them former English learners. And then we have the current English learners. So looking at this gradation here, what you would expect is in an English language test, the first group would do the best, second group coming next, etc. So because it's a gradation of whether English is a first language, proficiency-wise. But one issue with bilingualism in education is that we know socioeconomic status makes a big difference in children's language development, and it also confounds with bilingualism. And so I included that in my lecture. So would you agree that my 4 groups here represents the gradation of English language proficiency? So that should be what you see in standardized test. No. So let me unpack this graph before dinner time. You see the taller bars that says lunch equals 0. These are the children who are not eligible for free or reduced lunch. And the bars that says lunch equals 1 are the children who are eligible for free or reduced lunch. And the 4 groups are portrayed in gradation gray color here. So if you focus your attention on the lunch equals 0 group, which group is doing better here? The bilingual children. Now remember, this is not an experiment. I have no control over these data. And this is surprising, not only to myself, but also to educators in the Department of Education. Now, if you look at these data, you realize that the lowest performing group are the current English learners. And the former English learners are kind of in the middle, on par with the L1 English children. Now, what is surprising and what we really need to think about as a community is how do we get the children who are in the lowest performing groups here to the highest performing group? Essentially, they are the most similar children in demographics, but they're performing drastically different. So that's something that we have to think about, is whether our education system in general, in this case in Massachusetts, are suitable and helpful for the children who speak English as a second language. And what about bilingualism in special education? Now, if we follow our psychology hypothesis that bilingualism is a beneficial experience and it enhances cognitive control or executive functions in a certain way, what we would expect to see the interaction between bilingualism and reading difficulty, for example, is that some of these children may be compensated for their skills. Okay? And in all of the disability categories in special education, we pay special attention to those that relate to language and literacy development. So specific learning disability is one of those. And using our hypothesis from psychology, what we really know is that children who are developing English, and because of the legislature that we cannot exclude children for special education because of the language background, we would see an incidence in a shift. So we would see educators being more hesitant to identify children needing special services if they speak English as a second language. They may say, oh, they may be just needing more time to acquire the language, so let's wait, and then wait, and then wait. That also happens for children who speak English as a first language. They may just need more time. And alternatively, we can also think that for bilingual children who exercise 2 languages on a daily basis, they may be exercising the cognitive compensation to compensate the very skill that they're not doing so good at, such as reading, which takes a certain level of cognitive resources. So in those cases, we should see an under-identification. Okay? So we tasked with these 2 hypotheses And we look at the state level data again, this time in 2015. We just finished this analysis and finished a manuscript. So in this graph here, what you see is the native English speakers, so these are L1 English, and you have English proficient bilinguals and English language learners. So what's your general observations in data from 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade? Do you see more or less in the middle group compared to the first group? Yes, they have under-identification. So some of these children may not be identified for what they really need in learning to read successfully. And what about the English learners? So you have to wait and see. There's an initial under-identification, but a subsequent over-identification later on. Because you wait and wait and wait and realize that, oh my God, I can't wait, because they're expected to read to learn instead of learning to read. So we have to do something. And this observations is observed in both low-income children and also children from non-low-income background. So there's a lot more we have to think about how bilingualism brings into education. These are just 2 examples from state-level data that we can start paying attention to language experience and learning in general. Now I'm going to shift a little bit of focus to look at the environment. So remember I said that it's all about the environment, it's all about the input, the exposure, and the statistical complexity. So one thing that we observed in children in public education, interestingly, is that if you speak a language of the dominant community, you seem to be more willing to accept the fact that you can speak another language and it's totally cool. But if you speak a heritage language, you are more reluctant to speak your heritage language because you don't see the value of it. So we call these speakers of heritage language in lesser powerful role because they don't see the value of their heritage language. So we see a lot of these language attrition in elementary school. And some researchers reported this as early as kindergarten. Our own observations is around 3rd grade and 4th grade. So when they realize that language has power and position in a society. So we did a project that we want to see what the country thinks as perceived social value of bilingualism. So we're social scientists, but we're more used to doing laboratory settings, so this is the first time that we actually go out to the world, the country. And so we did a survey over 400 people using the data that map onto a census. So the data, the graph map you see here indicate the census that represents the non-English speakers in different regions of the United States. Blue indicates there are a smaller proportion, and hot color along the coastline indicates there are a higher proportion of people in the census that reported that they don't speak English at home. Okay? There's only one question in the American census that tackled this question. There are 7 questions in the Canadian census, and there are 14 questions in the European census. And so if you look at these data, our data is actually really well represented according to the census population. So we observed several things. So over these 400 people, we try to sample more of the bilinguals, and it's not easy to do, but we managed to get that most people speak English, but they also speak another language. So that's another thing is a lot of the government forms or school forms that you fill out, they rarely let you put in another language. They only have place for one language, and it's very difficult if you speak multiple languages to put in more languages in these government forms. And tackling my idea about the continuum between monolingualism and bilingualism, we put people into 4 different groups. We looked at people who reported English is not their first language, and they have multiple first language. Okay? We looked at people whose first language is English but speaks another language fluently. We looked at people who speak English as a first language and tried to learn it out too, but decided to give up. Okay? Yeah, I would be in that category. I mean, the latter part. Yeah, at this age and time, learning another language is just really taxing. I didn't have time to do homework, so I had to drop the course. And we also looked at people who reported English as their first language and only language, and they never tried to learn a second language. Okay, so if you have to make an educated guess, how would you see these people rate the value of bilingualism? Who would be the highest? From going up and down. Absolutely correct. So we have a gradation of judgment on the value of bilingualism. And so we also want to know what would make these people change their mind. So we specifically look at the first group, the group of people who speak English, the last group here actually, who speak English as a first language, never even tried out to. And we realized that it interacts with the number of people who speak a non-English language in their immediate environment. So we took their IP address and map it onto the census data, stating the proportion of people in that IP address area, in that zip code, who speak another language. And we find that people, even if you never try second language, you rate the value of bilingualism higher if you live in a neighborhood where you have more people who speak another language. So that all makes sense. I'm just trying to use scientific methods to prove folk wisdom. It's not easy, but it's fun. So what it tells us is that, yes, the society also has responsibility in shaping and receiving bilingualism and embracing bilingualism. I think we do a pretty good job in recognizing bilingualism, but I don't think we do a good enough job in embracing bilingualism. So coming to the end, bear with me for a few more minutes. So the science of bilingualism, like what I've been doing, is a transdisciplinary effort of grouping what I know from psychology, from neuroscience, and now trying to understand how education works, and bringing it all together to create new knowledge that we can actually bring back to the community, not just publishing in academic journals. And the most important thing is bilingualism is an experience that allows the children of tomorrow to adapt to a globalized 21st century society. We have to think broader. We can't think in the immediate community. We have to think about countries. We have to think about the world. And in order to adapt to this environment, you have to become bilingual. And to becoming bilingual is a responsibility for all. From a school, from a family, from a child, and from a community. And if you can only remember one thing from this talk, remember that it takes a village to raise a child, but it takes a country to embrace bilingualism. Thank you. I guess I can take questions. Yes?
Do you agree that the dominant language may shift between languages?
Yes, so the question is, do I think that dominant language may shift across a lifespan? That is an excellent question, and there is definitely a shift depending on which environment you're being placed. So that also plays up the importance of the environment. David Birdsong in UT Austin has done a lot of work in this area. Yes?
I have about 7 questions, but the first one is, do you know anything about what's the science around what language children dream in?
It's funny because I always get that question from me.
I don't think we know very much, right?
No, we don't know anything actually. I don't think there's a scientific evidence, a body of evidence to speak to that. What language do they dream in? I don't think dream comes in language form. It's in that phase of your mind is trying to figure out what to release and what to consolidate. So what we know is, before you sleep, if you are engaged in an experiment that makes you learn during sleep, the information gets retained. But nobody has ever done it in a bilingual manner, so we don't know. And my guess about children is language at their age, especially very young children in preschool age, we know that language is just a tool to express their thoughts. So it's a tool of convenience. Whatever concept they want to conveyed and represented in whatever language that they have available in their repertoire. They're going to just pick that. So it's a tool of convenience. Do you still want to ask your 6 remaining questions? Okay.
Do all languages exercise the brain equally, or are there some that are more challenging than others?
Very good question. So I think I can answer this question in different ways. So there are differentiation between just knowing how to speak these languages versus knowing how to read in these languages. So let me start with speaking multiple languages, whether there's a common neural representations in our brain. So when we speak multiple languages, the research says there's more convergence than more divergence, because our brain is equipped to be readily available to process different languages. So if you speak different languages, depending on what language you speak, such as I know this school has a Mandarin English program, and if you look at the process of reading a Chinese character versus a process of reading English, they're essentially different. But at the sound level, they're more similar than you think. So Chinese language is a syllabic language, so a lot of the sounds that comes in syllables, whereas in English, the phoneme, the smallest unit of sound, makes meaning of the word different. So in those cases, we may see some divergence, but there are more convergence than divergence. Now, when you think about reading, that's a completely different story, because when you're looking at reading, we have to think of the processes of reading. English, as I told some of the members in this community earlier today, is a notoriously hard to learn language. There are many symbols mapping to many sounds, and then plus a repertoire of exceptions. Right? So we have a lot of exceptions. We just have to remember all these exceptions. And so that process is very different from speaking or reading Spanish or Italian, because you read what you see in the symbol, you basically sound out the letter. You may not know what the word means, but you can sound it out. And that's two very different processes will require different neural resources to be successful. So for the reading, for biliteracy, you exercise more different parts of the brain. For bilingualism, it's more convergence than divergence. Yes? Gentleman in the back.
So in your non-linear slide, what part of the S curve translates to age where it starts rising most steeply?
So I don't have the full picture, which we're trying to gather. So we're looking for partners to allow us to do a longitudinal study, which will give us this most solid evidence. But with the cross-sectional evidence, what we observe is about 3rd grade, 4th grade. So around that part, the developmental stage where you switch from learning to read to reading to learn as the most critical period. So a lot of the children at that age, not only in language learning, but also in learning other things, such as a skill like sport or a musical instrument. That age seems to be a bottleneck for a lot of these children. And so to turn a knowledge into a skill set require a next level of practice and training, very much like language, because in terms of the curriculum, they're also expected to do more of the gaining new knowledge from the readings instead of just learning how to read. The mechanics is expected to be passed. And so in those cases, we observed there were a lot of struggles. And also in those cases, we expected that to be the bottleneck, that they're kind of intersect with the linear expectation, but it depends on whether they can work over that bottleneck to get to the higher level of the S curve, versus they may become stagnant. Yes, the lady in red. Lady in red.
So you talk about heritage language attrition for some children. So in this school, the children has a pretty high level of exposure to Chinese or Spanish or French until grade 5, and then they have a lower level of exposure. And then once they leave the school, would they just kind of lose the language, or what is the way to best for them to keep the language?
Okay, so the question is, there's a high level of exposure to target languages in the school, but then after the experience in the school, where do they go? Would they be stagnant or would they lose the language? Now, I can't speak to every family here, but in the United States, you really have to work hard to become bilingual and maintain it that way. So the management team and I talked a little bit about what else we can do to maintain that. So there are examples such as traveling. I know, traveling, it costs money. But there are other ways to keep in touch with organizations abroad so you can maintain that value. But personally, as a parent of a bilingual child, I can tell you the most important thing is the family value. And that the family recognize and respect multiple languages and foster a safe environment for the children to keep using that language, even though they may not be native or perfect, is a key to maintaining the usage for that language. I have to say, I took French when I was very young, and at the university level, I keep taking French, because it just seems like a logical step. And it's just a logical step that I want to continue to learn more. So if the foundation of language learning is very solid in the school, I know a lot of you are worried about high school. Like, where are you going to go to high school? Would they support this kind of language? Unfortunately, you can't expect the school to do everything. So sometimes even at the high school level, we have to do something as a community. So that's when I say that it takes a community to recognize and embrace bilingualism, is exactly that. Yeah.
You joked about using science to prove the wisdom that many of us already know about learning languages. And I thought that was funny because, you know, so much of from a public policy point of view, so many of the school systems here in the United States, they expose you to a second language in high school.
Yep. They have that expectation.
Many of my friends have had 4 years of French or Spanish and cannot speak a word at this point. So we know, and as you demonstrated with your science and your charts, that we've always had this wisdom that you need to expose children to a second language at a very young age for them truly to become bilingual. And yet, you're not seeing a lot of public policy change throughout the United States. I think I read recently that they are embracing that in Utah, of all places. I think it's, Mormons tend to go out into the world and do their missionaries, and so they have embraced bilingualism, and you're seeing a lot of teaching of many languages at the elementary school level. I think it's great, but you're still not seeing a lot of that.
No, I agree with you, and I just told the team about Utah today, the meeting. So your question, or I should say your observations, is correct. In the United States, education, unfortunately, it's not only an education problem. It's also a political problem, and it's also an economic problem. And so I think what I come as a researcher, what I have observed is bilingualism is not going to hurt you, and in a lot of ways it's going to help you to develop and learn. So the question of whether we should have bilingual education is not important. We should think about what we should do to improve bilingual education. Can we do it well? How do we do it well? So I'm glad that you brought up the public policy angle, because at the policy level, we're not only looking at individual child, we're looking at children as a system. Now that's how policymakers think, is they look at test scores. They look at quantifiable metrics that you can measure performance or growth, okay? Now, in that case, we also have to think about, are we equipping the teachers well enough out of a teacher's training program to teach children with 2 languages? We may not. And who are we attracting as teachers? So now we have to think of the human capital level. That is beyond my pay grade here. But I'm very interested in that type of question. How can we do, like, what can we do as adults? Sometimes if you expect behavioral change in children, we don't only look at children, because children are children. we have to look at the human capacity. We have to look at the capital we have. Infrastructure as well as human capital. How do we enrich those to help the children? That's an indirect way of thinking, but that's a theory of change, that we expect we change something in this equation, and that will ultimately change child outcome.
If I could just follow up.
Yeah.
It seems like maybe this is too simple, but we already are spending the resources on having second language teachers at an older level. It seems like such a simple, easy switch to make, to move those teachers to elementary school and give kids the option to learn, even if it's just a little bit of exposure to it. My experience, having learned Arabic lucky enough to learn Arabic at a young age because I lived overseas for 2 years, was that 2 years as a kid being exposed to a language is like a lifetime as an adult. We discussed that age group and how you can learn, you can just take on a second language so easy at a young age. Doesn't that just seem like such an easy fix? Move those teachers to elementary school.
I wish all the education problem can be an easy fix like that. Now think of it this way. How children learn a second language and how adults learn a second language are essentially different. As children, you are learning in the environment, so you're taking abstract signal in the environment and trying to gather data and make sense of it. It's a more naturalistic way of learning, so you won't expect children sitting down and learning the syntax of Arabic language as a second language. But as adults, we have the capacity to read, so literacy actually helps us to learn another language. And for that kind of experience, it's essentially different. So even though I agree that it's the earlier the better, but resource constraints prohibit us to do that, what we should think about is how can we be more efficient in teaching a second language in the public system?
I'm just kind of going back to your point of how do we continue bilingualism as we get older. It seems like a lot of the data shows that the cognitive flexibility and attention and the kind of frontal lobe functions of the brain are developing better with bilingualism throughout childhood. So even if you lose maybe some of that language as you get older because you're not speaking it readily, are you still, my question I guess is, are we still seeing those effects of the earlier bilingualism, like the earlier language learning, I guess I should say?
Excellent question. There's a study just came out a couple months ago. So if you have to think of a scenario whereby you have the earliest experience of a native language, and then you switch to another language, what would that be? International adoption before the age 1. So that's exactly what these researchers looked at, is now that they become adults in Montreal and they don't speak French and they have no knowledge. They claim they have no knowledge of their native language. And when they look at their brain and look at how they respond to their native language, their brains are more similar to the bilinguals who are fluent in that language compared to those who have never been exposed to that language. So one thing for sure is whatever we do in our life leaves a mark in our brains. Now it makes an effort to trigger and revitalize some of these memories. And whether these people are learning the native language faster than the monolingual individuals who've never been exposed to that language is a question. So that would be a really interesting question to investigate. One more question? Ooh, there are 2 hands, maybe 2. Last 2? Okay, lady first and then the gentleman.
So, talking about heritage language attrition, I grew up very close to my mom's brother and his family, and he had been in the Peace Corps for 10 years and lived in Ecuador and Peru, which is where his wife was from. And they spoke Spanish in the home, always. They always speak Spanish to each other. And my cousins, their children, who are my age, here I was, the child next to this family, and I thought it was amazing that they could speak this other secret language that I could not understand. And yet my cousins, who were my own same age, chose not to speak Spanish, although they can understand it. They did not want.
They don't want to speak it.
Yeah, and I've always been, and even now we have, my children are similar to my cousin's age children, and my aunt and uncle take care of my niece, essentially, Amelia, and they're very hesitant to speak Spanish to her because their children rejected them for speaking Spanish to them. And I'm like, I'm paying a small fortune to teach my children a second language because I thought it was so cool that you guys have this. And I think that you've probably thought about this, and I don't understand where that disconnect comes from.
I don't know either. It's human behavior. That's one beauty of human behavior, is unpredictable. It's not like physics that you have a formula and you can predict. And surprisingly, we have a lot more reluctance to speak a heritage language in the United States than other parts of the world.
Because it's not valued.
It's not valued at the community level. So there are a couple of things that comes to mind. I visited Ecuador during my sabbatical, and we went to Cuenca. It was a very beautiful city. And I was invited to give a talk, which I thought to university students, and then I realized that there's this minister of, I don't remember what it is, started to appear, and it turns into a talk to policymakers, and in 2 hours. They told me 2 hours before that. And so the interesting thing about the situation in Ecuador is they are trying to revitalize some of these indigenous languages, such as Quito. And that's a language that they're trying to revitalize and recognize in school. So they don't want the children to only speak Spanish. The parents want Quito in school. The children want Quito in school. And the government wants Quito in school. So I said, why invite me to give a talk? It's like preaching to the choir. Like, why make me fly all the way down there? And they made a really good point that I didn't think about as an academic. They said, policies change. We want to have science to back our policy-making decisions. And then I realized that, yeah, policy changes actually drives the community's receptiveness to language diversity. And sometimes we don't realize the decision we make as adults actually seep through to younger children and encourage or disencourage them to make certain decisions, such as language and power. And that's a sociolinguistic domain of work that I would like to work with linguists to investigate that. I'm not an expert in that, but I think as a parent, I can tell you that the way that parent and family values heritage language is very important in sustaining that language in the next generation. Yeah, you see the diversity in the family as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, last question from the gentleman.
Are there combinations of languages that are known to be more beneficial to children? If you speak Russian and Polish, you're going to do great in school.
So, what kind of benefits are they talking about?
maybe, I don't know, that's what I'm asking. Are there a combination of languages that do specific things?
I don't know any research that speaks to that. But we also don't know enough. I know there's a book published called The Economic Value of Bilingualism. So the people that they study in Latin America who speak 3 languages, Portuguese, Spanish, and an indigenous language, are the people who make the most money. So there's that. If you're looking for a return of investment, I guess that's a good argument. But we understand that not everything we do have a return of investment. So it's a very difficult question. I don't think I have an answer. So I'll leave you with more questions than answer, but thank you for being here with me tonight.